By the second morning of the search, the sheriff had already told the family what nobody wanted to hear, that the odds dropped the way a stone drops once a child has been missing more than 36 hours. What he had not accounted for was a 19-year-old gelding named Ferrous tearing through a cedar fence rail with enough force to open a gash along his own shoulder and walking in slow, deliberate circles around one particular patch of ground behind the north pasture, pawing at the earth until his hoof bled through the frog and nobody could get him to stop. Corinne Voss stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee she had made 3 hours earlier and never touched, watching the horse work the same 6 feet of dirt for the 4th time that morning, and she told herself it meant nothing. She told herself horses did strange things when the routine of a household broke apart, when strangers in orange vests tramped through the pasture calling a boy's name into the tree line, when the air itself seemed to carry a kind of wrongness that animals could smell before people could name it. She did not know yet that Ferrous had done this before. Nobody had been watching the last time. She did not know that the last place her son had stood on his own 2 legs, breathing on his own, was almost exactly where the horse now stood. And she did not know that the ground 14 inches beneath that patch of dirt was hollow, had been hollow for 11 years, and had been waiting. The search teams called it off for the night before anyone thought to ask why the horse would not leave that corner of the fence line alone, even after the volunteers packed up their thermoses and drove their trucks back down the gravel road, even after the temperature dropped and the frost came in low across the grass. Ferrous stood there in the dark with his breath fogging and his ears pinned flat, and he dug. What happened before anyone understood what he was doing would stay with the people of that county for years. By the time the sun came up fully that second morning, there were 14 trucks parked along the gravel shoulder of the county road, their headlights still burning against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it would clear or turn to rain. Volunteers stood in loose knots near the mailbox, coffee going cold in their hands, waiting for Sheriff Castellan to hand out grid assignments, and every single one of them could hear it from where they stood. The steady, rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves against packed earth, over and over, from somewhere behind the barn. A few of them asked Hollis about it. He told them the horse was spooked. He believed it himself mostly, because the alternative was a thought too strange to hold on to in the middle of an actual emergency. And there wasn't room in that morning for strange thoughts. There was only room for grid lines and flashlights, and a mother standing at her kitchen window with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the tree line for a small shape that did not come. 3 weeks before the horse tore through the fence rail, Emery Voss turned 8 years old in a kitchen that smelled like burnt candle wax, because his mother had lit 9 candles instead of 8 out of habit from the year before, and hadn't caught the mistake until the whole cake was already glowing. He was a serious kind of child, the kind adults described as an old soul without quite being able to explain what they meant by it. And he carried a folding pocket knife everywhere he went that had belonged to his grandfather, its bone handle worn smooth and the initials EV scratched crooked into the metal near the hinge. Nobody had ever corrected him on the fact that those initials were also his own. Emery Charles Voss, named for Elias Charles Voss, the grandfather who had died the winter before Emery turned 6, and who had left behind exactly 2 things that mattered to the boy: a horse named Ferrous and a well that had been capped and buried behind the north pasture fence since before Corinne was born. Corinne had raised her son alone since he was 2, after a marriage that ended quietly and without much drama, the kind of ending that leaves behind no villain to be angry at, only a slow accumulation of 2 people wanting different lives. She had moved back to her father-in-law's farm, partly out of necessity and partly, she would admit only to herself, out of a need to give her son something solid to stand on. Roots that went down further than a rented apartment 2 towns over ever could. She worked as a physical therapist 3 days a week at the clinic in town, and on the days she wasn't there, she was up before dawn doing chores that Elias used to do without complaint, and that she had never quite learned to do without complaining, at least internally, at least in the privacy of her own tired head. She was not, by nature, a fanciful woman. She believed in appointments and antibiotics and load-bearing walls, and she had always regarded her father-in-law's evening ritual with the horse as one of those small eccentricities old men earn the right to keep, something she filed away without examining too closely. What she had not fully registered in the 2 years since his death was how completely her son had absorbed that ritual as his own inheritance, quietly, without asking permission, the way children take up the habits of people they've lost as a way of keeping them near. The farm had been in the family for 3 generations. 112 acres of rolling grass and cedar brake outside, a town small enough that the volunteer fire department doubled as the search and rescue unit, and Elias had worked every inch of it with a kind of patience that Corinne remembered mostly through. The sound of his voice carrying across the pasture in the evenings, low and even, talking to the horse the way other men talk to their dogs. What she did not fully understand, until much later, was that Elias had not simply talked to Ferrous out of habit. Every evening at dusk, for as long as anyone in the family could recall, the old man had walked the horse to the same fence corner and stood there for exactly as long as it took the light to fail completely, and then he had walked back to the house without a word about where he'd been or why. Emery had asked him once, when he was small enough to still be carried on Elias's shoulders through the tall grass, what he was listening for out there in the dark. Your great-grandfather, Elias, had told him. He's still down there somewhere, if you know how to listen. He fell in this well when he was younger than you, and the men who pulled him out capped it with a slab of stone so it would never happen to anyone else, but stone doesn't stop a sound from finding its way up through the dirt. You put your ear close enough to the ground on a still evening, and you can hear him breathing. That's what I come out here for, just to make sure he's still breathing. It was the kind of story a man tells a child half as comfort and half as myth, the sort of thing that gets folded into family legend without anyone quite deciding whether to believe it. And Corinne had heard the story exactly once, secondhand, from Emery himself, months after his grandfather's funeral, and she had assumed it was nothing more than an old man's way of making a dead relative feel less gone. She did not know that after Elias died, Emery had gone looking for that patch of ground on his own. She did not know that Ferrous had let him. The evening routine Corinne noticed in the months after Elias's death was that Ferrous had started pacing the fence line around dusk, no matter what the weather was doing, restless in a way the old vet chalked up to grief, since horses, he said, do grieve, and sometimes for longer than people expect. What Corinne did not notice, because a working single mother running a farm alone rarely has the hours left over to track her 8-year-old's exact whereabouts between 5 and 6 in the evening, was that her son had started slipping out through the mudroom door at almost the same time every night, crossing the pasture in the fading light, and sitting with the horse at the exact spot his grandfather used to stand. He would put his ear to the cold ground, the way Elias had taught him, and some evenings, if the wind was still enough, he swore he could hear something, a hollow rhythmic sound, faint as a held breath. He called it the grandfather's heartbeat, both grandfathers folded together into one word in the private mythology of a lonely, imaginative boy. And he never told his mother, because some part of him understood, the way children understand things without being told, that it belonged only to him and the horse. That was the detail nobody thought to mention to the search teams. Not because anyone was hiding it, because nobody who knew about it thought it mattered. The day Emery disappeared began the way most days on the farm began, with chores before school and a rushed breakfast and Corinne calling out reminders about homework as she backed the truck down the drive. It was a Saturday, so there was no school, only the wide, Unstructured hours of a farm kid's weekend, and the last confirmed sighting of Emery Voss was just after 2 in the afternoon, when a neighbor 2 properties over saw him crouched at the edge of the orchard with the family's border collie, Whistle, chasing something through the grass that the neighbor assumed was a rabbit. By 4:30, Whistle came home without him, alone, muddy up to the belly, and agitated in a way that made Corinne's stomach drop before she had even finished calling her son's name across the yard. By 6, she had called the sheriff. By 9, there were 14 volunteers with flashlights, walking grid patterns across 112 acres of farmland bordered by 2 miles of dense cedar brake, a seasonal creek prone to flash flooding, and a half-mile east, an abandoned limestone quarry that had swallowed exactly 1 careless teenager back in the 90s and had been fenced off with warning signs ever since. The quarry was where they concentrated the search first. It made a terrible kind of sense, a deep water hazard with a known history, close enough to the orchard that an 8-year-old chasing a dog could conceivably wander that far without realizing it. Divers were called in from the county seat 40 minutes away. They searched the black water in shifts through the night and into the following morning, and they found nothing, no clothing, no tracks along the crumbling limestone lip, nothing at all to suggest the boy had ever come near it. And by noon on the first full day of searching, the quarry theory quietly died and the search fanned back out into the woods. A K-9 unit arrived from the state police barracks a little after 10 that first morning. A lean, focused shepherd named Duchess, who took Emery's scent from a pillowcase and worked the orchard in tight, methodical passes before pulling hard toward the tree line east of the property, toward the creek. For 3 hours, that became the new center of gravity for the entire search. 40 volunteers converging on a half-mile stretch of seasonal water that had been running high after a week of scattered rain, wading the shallows, combing the brush along both banks, calling the boy's name into a landscape that gave nothing back. They found one of Emery's shoes there, snagged in a fallen branch a quarter-mile downstream, and for 20 minutes the search took on a different, heavier quality, the kind of focused dread that comes when a piece of a missing child turns up somewhere he shouldn't have been able to reach without help. It was Hollis, wading out to retrieve it himself, who pointed out what the divers eventually confirmed, that the shoe had almost certainly washed down from higher ground during the week's rain, loosened from mud near the orchard fence line, where the dog had clearly been digging days earlier at a groundhog hole, nothing more. Another door closing. Another hour lost. The creek search wound down by mid-afternoon, and the grid shifted again, this time toward the dense cedar brake that ran along the property's northern boundary, 2 miles of tangled brush where a small child could, in theory, wander for days without crossing a single trail. Nobody, in all of that first full day, thought to walk the 6 feet of open pasture directly behind the north fence, because it was open ground, mowed grass, nothing to hide a child, and nothing to explain why a search dog trained to follow scent along the ground would have any reason to pull toward it. Duchess never once tried. Later, a trainer would explain to Castellan, almost apologetically, that a scent trail 18 feet underground, sealed beneath broken concrete and packed earth, was not something any dog on Earth could reasonably be expected to detect from the surface. It was not a failure of the animal. It was simply outside what scent could do. It was, however, apparently not outside what something else could do. Ferrous had been agitated since the moment the search began, but for the first day, everyone had an explanation ready-made. Horses pick up on stress. Horses react to strangers, to raised voices, to the smell of fear on the people they trust. Hollis Draven, who had worked the ranch as Elias's hand for 11 years, and stayed on afterward because Corinne couldn't run the place, alone and wouldn't sell it either, was the first person to notice that the horse's agitation had a shape to it, a direction, a repeated destination. By the second evening, Ferrous had stopped eating. He stood at the north fence corner from dusk until well past dark, and when Hollis finally led him back to the barn near midnight, exhausted and unwilling, the horse fought the lead rope the entire way, throwing his head, planting his feet, making a sound low in his chest that Hollis, who had spent 30 years around horses, had never heard one make before. What Hollis didn't say out loud that first night, because it sounded insane even inside his own head, was that the horse wasn't behaving like an animal reacting to chaos. He was behaving like an animal that knew exactly where something was, and could not understand why the humans around him kept walking past it. The morning Ferrous broke the fence rail. He had already tried before to get out of the paddock, both times through the gate, both times stopped by Hollis before he made it more than a few yards. The third time, at 5:15, before the search volunteers had even arrived for the day, he went through solid cedar instead, splitting a rail that took 2 men and a truck jack to install the previous spring, opening a 4-inch gash along his shoulder in the process, and he did not slow down. He crossed the pasture at a dead run and stopped, all at once, at the same 6 feet of ground he'd been circling for 2 days, and he began to dig. Corinne found out from Hollis's shout across the yard, and by the time she reached the fence line, barefoot, still in the shirt she'd slept in for the second night in a row, Ferrous had already torn a shallow crater into the dirt with his front hooves, blood from his shoulder streaking down into the churned earth, and he showed no sign of stopping, even as Hollis got a hand on his halter and tried to pull him back. She would tell this story many times in the years that followed. The part she always paused before telling was this part, the part where she stood at that fence and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the morning air, because some instinct older and stupider and more honest than reason told her the horse was not panicking. He was trying to tell them something. The sheriff, a broad, weathered man named Boone Castellan, who had run search operations in that county for going on 20 years, and had seen every kind of grief a missing persons case could produce, arrived at the farm a little after 7 that morning to find Corinne on her knees in the dirt beside the horse, digging at the same crater with her bare hands, and Hollis standing over both of them, not sure whether to stop her or help her. Castellan had learned, over 2 decades of this work, that grieving families sometimes fixated on things. A dream, a feeling, a detail that meant nothing to anyone but them, seized on with a desperation that had nowhere else to go. He had seen mothers convinced a certain bird call was a sign. He had seen fathers drive 4 hours based on a hunch that turned out to be exhaustion talking. He did not say any of this to Corinne. He crouched down next to her instead, put a hand on her shoulder, and told her gently that they had 18 more volunteers arriving within the hour to walk the creek line east, that the K-9 unit from the state was due by 9, and that digging at random ground with her hands was not going to bring her son home faster. What he did not know, because nobody had told him, and because the family itself had never thought to connect it, was that this particular 6 feet of ground had a history. It was Hollis who finally said it out loud, standing at the fence with his hat off, sweat cutting through the dust on his face despite the cold morning. He said that Elias used to come stand right here every evening of his life. Right here, this exact spot, not 10 feet from where they were all standing. He said it in the tone of a man offering information he wasn't sure was useful, the kind of detail you mention almost apologetically, because it feels too soft, too sentimental, to matter in the middle of an emergency. Castellan asked him why. Hollis said he never rightly knew. Elias wasn't a man who explained himself. But there was a story, something about a well that used to be here, before it got capped off, back before Hollis's time even. And every evening like clockwork, the old man would walk the horse out and just stand there a while. For the first time since the search began, Sheriff Boone Castellan felt something shift in his understanding of what he was looking at, though he could not yet have said what it meant. only that the hair along his arms had risen the way it did on the rare occasions in his career when a case stopped behaving like a mystery and started behaving like a confession that hadn't finished being spoken yet. He asked whether there were any old property surveys, any maps that might show a capped well on that section of the land. There were. It took Corinne almost 40 minutes to find them, in a box of her father-in-law's papers she hadn't opened since the funeral. And there, in the brittle blue lines of a hand-drawn survey dated decades before she was born, was a small circle marked with the word well, and a note in faded pencil that read capped 1958, unsafe, do not disturb. The location on the survey, measured against the fence line that still stood today, put the mouth of that well almost exactly beneath the 6 feet of ground Ferrous had spent 2 days trying to tear open with his hooves. Nobody moved for a long moment after that. Castellan looked at the survey. He looked at the horse, who had gone quiet now, standing with his head low over the crater he'd dug, his sides heaving, blood dried dark along his shoulder. And he looked at Corinne, whose face had gone the particular gray of a person doing arithmetic she does not want to finish. What none of them said aloud, because none of them could yet bring themselves to, was the obvious and terrible possibility that a boy chasing a dog through tall grass on a Saturday afternoon might have found ground that had been unsafe for going on 70 years, ground nobody living had thought to warn him about, because nobody living had thought about that well in longer than Emery had been alive. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a rescue scene in the moment before anyone will say the word out loud, and it settled over that pasture then, broken only by the sound of the horse breathing hard through his nose and the distant call of a search volunteer somewhere down by the creek, still working a grid pattern that everyone standing at that fence now understood, with a sick and sudden certainty, was searching in entirely the wrong direction. It would be easy, telling this story, to skip straight to what happened next. But there is a part of it that came before, that belongs here, because it is the part that explains why none of this was as simple as a boy falling into a hole. Elias Voss had not built the cap on that well. His own father had, in 1958, after a 9-year-old boy named Warren Voss, Elias's older brother, had fallen through a rotted wooden cover that had sat over the opening for decades before that, and had been pulled out 4 hours later, alive, hypothermic, and changed in some way the family never spoke about in detail, beyond saying that Warren was never quite himself afterward, that he startled at loud sounds for the rest of his life, that he moved away from that farm the moment he turned 18, and never came back, not even for his own father's funeral. The well had been capped with 2 feet of poured concrete and a slab of limestone dragged in by mule team, and for decades it had simply been a story, the kind every old farm has buried somewhere in its history, an accident nobody talks about directly, but everyone somehow knows the shape of. What almost nobody knew, because Elias had never told a living soul except eventually, in fragments, an 8-year-old boy who idolized him, was that Elias had gone out to that spot every single evening of his adult life, not out of superstition, but out of a promise. He had made it to his own father at the old man's deathbed, a promise that someone in the family would always remember that ground was there, would always keep watch over it, so that what happened to Warren could never happen to anyone else without someone noticing fast enough to matter. He had kept that promise for 43 years. There had been a period in the middle of that stretch when he had come close to breaking it. Corinne knew, distantly, that Elias had gone through a hard decade in his 40s. After his own wife died young, when the farm nearly went under, and he had considered selling off the north pasture to a developer who wanted the land for a gravel operation. She did not know that the sale had gotten as far as a signed letter of intent before Elias walked out to that fence corner one evening, stood there longer than usual, and came back inside to tell his own father, long dead by then, but somehow still the person he was answering to, that he wasn't going to do it. He tore up the letter that night. He never explained why to anyone who asked, and eventually people stopped asking, filing it away as one more piece of an old man's stubbornness rather than what it actually was, which was a promise reasserting itself at the exact moment it was about to be abandoned. And when he died, the promise had nowhere to go. Corinne didn't know the story in full. Hollis knew only the outline. The only living creature who had witnessed every single evening of that vigil, who had stood beside Elias at that fence corner more nights than anyone could count, was the horse. And in the 2 years since Elias's death, in the quiet unwitnessed hour between 5 and 6 every evening, it was not only the horse who had kept coming back. By the time Castellan called in a structural team from the county to assess the ground, it was nearly noon, and the temperature had begun climbing toward an afternoon that the weather service was calling unseasonably warm. Warm enough that the frost damage to the old concrete cap, already compromised by decades of freeze and thaw cycles nobody had monitored, had likely worsened overnight. The team's initial assessment, delivered in the flat, careful language of men trained not to promise anything they couldn't guarantee, was that ground-penetrating radar showed a clear void beneath the surface, roughly 4 feet down, consistent with an old well shaft, and that a significant crack in what remained of the original concrete cap suggested at least a partial collapse. They could not yet say whether that collapse was recent. They could not yet say whether anyone was down there. What they could say, and did say gently, to a mother standing at the edge of a fence line with her hands still raw from digging, was that if her son had fallen through, the drop itself was survivable. That wells of this era and construction typically ran 20 to 30 feet before reaching water table in that part of the county, and that a small child landing in loose debris rather than open water had a real chance of surviving the fall itself. What they did not say, because it did not need saying, was that surviving the fall and surviving 2.5 days in a cold, dark, confined space with no food or water was an entirely different arithmetic. The excavation began within the hour. It could not be rushed the way Corinne wanted it rushed, because heavy equipment near an already compromised void risked collapsing the shaft further, risked bringing down exactly the kind of debris that could crush or bury whoever was beneath it. And so the work went slow and careful. Hand tools and a small excavator working in short, careful passes. Engineers calling out measurements. A paramedic crew standing by with equipment for hypothermia and dehydration and injuries nobody could yet name. Ferrous would not leave the fence line. Hollis had given up trying to move him hours ago, and the horse stood there through the entire excavation, ears forward, utterly still except for an occasional low sound in his chest that one of the younger volunteers, a woman named Preya, who had grown up around horses herself, said sounded almost like calling, not a whinny. Something quieter, something aimed at the ground. The work itself moved in agonizing increments. A hand trowel, a bucket, a pause while an engineer checked a laser level against the shaft wall for any sign of further slippage. Twice, small slides of loose debris rattled down into the dark from somewhere below the visible collapse, and both times the entire crew went rigid, listening, because a slide of that size directly above an unconscious child was the one outcome nobody standing at that fence line allowed themselves to say out loud. Twice, nothing followed. Twice, the work resumed, slower than before. Castellan crouched at the edge of the widening hole for most of that hour, close enough to hear every scrape of the trowel, and it was there, a little after 2 in the afternoon, that one of the crew members froze mid-motion, her hand still buried in loosened soil, and lifted out something small and metal that caught the light. A folding pocket knife, its bone handle dark with damp earth, 2 crooked initials scratched into the steel near the hinge. She held it up without understanding what it was, and Corinne, watching from the fence, made a sound that brought Hollis's hand instantly to her shoulder, because she recognized it before anyone told her what it was. It had been in her son's pocket the morning he disappeared. It should not have been within 30 feet of that hole. It had fallen, they would later understand, from Emery's pocket during the fall itself, working its way up through the loosened debris as the ground beneath him continued, slowly, to settle. It was not evidence of where he had been. It was evidence of exactly how close, for 2.5 days, everyone searching this farm had been standing to him without knowing it. At 2:40 in the afternoon, one of the excavation crew, clearing debris by hand from what remained of the collapsed cap, went still, held up a hand for silence across the entire site, and everyone, 40-some people spread across that pasture, stopped moving at once. In the silence, faint, muffled by feet of earth and broken stone, came a sound. It took another 11 minutes of careful, agonizing work to open the shaft wide enough to lower a camera on a cable. And in those 11 minutes, nobody at that fence line said a single word, because the not knowing had become its own kind of unbearable. A held breath stretched thin enough that Corinne would later say she stopped being able to feel her own hands. The camera showed a boy curled against the curved limestone wall roughly 18 feet down, conscious, filthy, one arm cradled against his chest at an angle that told the paramedics, before they even got eyes on him directly, that something was broken, and blinking up into a beam of light he had clearly not expected to ever see again. Emery Voss had fallen through rotted plywood that some previous owner, decades back, had laid over the original crack in the concrete cap without ever telling anyone, chasing after Whistle, who had bolted after a rabbit straight across the exact patch of ground the family had spent 70 years quietly avoiding without ever teaching him to avoid it too. He had landed hard on a slope of accumulated debris, 18 feet down, breaking his forearm in the fall, and for 2.5 days he had done the only thing an 8-year-old raised on his grandfather's stories knew how to do in the dark. He had listened for the heartbeat, and some evenings, faint and rhythmic and impossibly close, he swore he could hear it answering back. What he did not know, curled in the dark with a broken arm and a voice gone hoarse from calling up toward a distant disk of daylight that grew smaller every night, was that 18 feet above him, at almost exactly the hour his grandfather used to keep his vigil, a horse who had never once missed that appointment in 2 years, was standing at the fence with his ears pinned toward the ground, refusing every attempt to be led away, because some sense older than language had told him, with total and unshakable certainty, that the boy was still breathing down there, and that breathing was not a thing you were allowed to walk away from. The rescue took another 90 minutes once they had eyes on him, a careful, harnessed lowering of a paramedic small enough to fit the narrow shaft, a slow and deliberate extraction that could not be rushed no matter how many people at that fence line were praying it would go faster. And when Emery Voss finally came up out of that ground into daylight, strapped to a backboard, blinking against the sun, dehydrated and broken-armed and shaking with cold, the sound that came out of Corinne Voss was not a word at all. It came from somewhere underneath language, and Hollis Draven, a man who had not cried in front of another person since his own father's funeral 15 years earlier, did not try particularly hard to stop himself either. Ferrous did not stop his low, steady sound until the moment the backboard cleared the surface. Then, and only then, standing there at the fence with blood dried along his torn shoulder and 2.5 days of refusal behind him, he went quiet and put his head down and began very calmly to eat grass, as though the entire ordeal had simply concluded on schedule, exactly as expected. At the hospital that evening, once the arm had been set and the IV fluids had done their slow work, and Emery was well enough to talk, though still weak, still hoarse, he told his mother, in the careful and precise way children sometimes deliver the most important information of their lives, almost as an afterthought, that he hadn't been scared the whole time. Not really. Because he could hear Ferrous up there. not just walking around, talking, the way Grandpa used to say he would if you knew how to listen. Corinne did not correct him. In the days that followed, once Emery was home from the hospital with his arm in a cast and a healing wariness of tall grass that the family doctor said would likely fade with time. Sheriff Castellan came by the farm one last time, not for any official reason, just to see the boy on his feet. He stood at the fence with Corinne for a long while, watching Ferrous graze in the low evening light, and admitted that in 22 years of search and rescue work, he had filed plenty of reports that leaned on instinct dressed up as method. He had never once written the words a horse indicated probable location, and meant it the way he found himself meaning it now. He said he didn't expect anyone downtown to put much stock in that detail when they filed the county's incident report. And he was right, they didn't. The official summary credited a review of historical property surveys and nothing more. But he said he'd know what actually happened out there for the rest of his career. And some version of it, he suspected, would follow him quietly into every search he ran afterward, whether he ever said so out loud again or not. Corinne has said, in the years since, that she still doesn't entirely know how to explain what that horse understood, or when he first understood it, or whether 2 years of quiet, unwitnessed evening vigils by a grieving animal keeping a dead man's promise is the kind of thing that can be explained at all. And she has stopped trying. What she knows is this. Every evening now, a little before dusk, Ferrous walks himself to that same fence corner, the ground long since properly sealed by an engineering crew with steel and reinforced concrete, permanently this time, and every evening a boy with a faint scar along his forearm walks out to meet him there, and the two of them stand together at the fence for exactly as long as it takes the light to fail completely, and then they walk back to the house without a word about where they've been or why. The same way it was done for 43 years before either of them was born, and neither of them has ever once needed it explained.